time. But we're thrilled that you're here. We have some very exciting things and insights to share with you as we are making some tremendous progress in our research project. Michael, if I can get you to move ahead a little bit in the slides. So that is me, and there's my email if you want to contact me. You can also find my contact information on our website. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by 4 incredible panelists who are also taking time out of their busy schedules to be here with us and share their insights. And I hope you'll find this conversation as informative as I do every time I interact with these people. So today we'll be joining with We'll be joined by Dr. Christina Hackett, who is a Principal Research Associate at the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. As an RDC project lead for the State of Mentoring Research Initiative, Dr. Hackett brings her clinical and research experience developing and leading programs in mental health and youth development, and working alongside youth and community programs to co-design evaluation approaches. Dr. Hackett holds a PhD in health policy, specializing in health economics from McMaster University, as well as master's degrees in counseling psychology from Adler University and in health policy planning and financing from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Michael Geringer is the Director of Research and Evaluation for Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership in the United States. He oversees research projects as well as those related to the translation of mentoring research into program practice. Mike has worked in the mentoring and education fields for over 17 years, primarily on training and technical assistance projects serving federally or state-funded mentoring programs. He also leads data collection and evaluation projects in an effort to highlight the prevalence and impact of mentoring across the United States. His role also supports advocacy and policy efforts by identifying and synthesizing research to encourage public and private organizations to make more impactful investments in the youth mentoring field. Mike Geringer has authored and edited many guidebooks and program tools. I'm sure some of you have worked with them in the past. Those tools support youth mentoring in schools and in community settings, including the 4th edition of the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring, the Power of Relationship Studies on America's Mentoring Experiences, and studies examining youth mentoring services across America, and we'll learn a lot more about these today. We're also joined by Ashley Bach. Ashley is a member of the Michigan. Sorry, Ashley, can you please correct my pronunciation? You can unmute your mic.
You're close. It's Michigan.
Thank you.
Yeah, it used to be called Osnabrück, so that's an easier way to say it.
Ashley currently sits on the board of Youth in Care Canada, a national nonprofit led by and for youth in care and from child welfare systems across the country. Ashley also sits on the Anishinaabe Nations Youth Council, and she plays an instrumental role in our State of Mentoring Research Project as she helps advise us on the development of our studies and surveys to ensure that they capture First Nation youth on and off reserves, as well as youth involved in child welfare systems perspective and experiences. Finally, we're joined by Dr. Christina Rinaldi, who is a professor of school and clinical child psychology in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. Dr. Rinaldi's research focuses on areas of social and emotional learning and development of children and adolescents. Dr. Rinaldi is also the principal investigator of the Learning Engagement in Parenting Lab, which studies social and emotional development in early childhood through adolescence. The LEAP Lab's research primarily focuses on children and adolescents' primary relationships with parents, peers, and teachers. So 4 incredible panelists bringing to us different perspectives. But before we jump ahead into our conversations with them, I will recap or give you an overview of what we call the State of Mentoring Research Initiative, which is a massive undertaking that CMP is has started doing in September, and we're going to keep this going until December, since we are trying to achieve 3 main things with this research project. The first one is trying to understand what young people's experiences of mentoring looks like across the country. We call that mapping the gap, and the way we're doing that is through national surveys. We did a panel survey back in January and February where we got 3,100 responses, which is great. But we also know that there are gaps in the types of responses that we can get through a panel survey. So right now we have an open link survey that you can access, that you can share with young people ages 18 to 30 in your communities, to make sure that we capture as many different perspectives as possible and that we can achieve the most comprehensive view of what mentoring looks like for young people in our country. This survey is available in French and in English, as is all of our other components of our research projects. So please, if you're under 30, fill the survey. If you know young people ages 18 to 30 in your community who would be interested in the survey, please share that with us. Michael, can you please move to the next slide? As you can see, we need your help to make sure that we capture the points of view and experiences of young people across the country, and we're offering incentives for young people to participate and tell us what they think. You can hear more and learn more about this survey by visiting our website, mentoringcanada.ca/state-of-mentoring. That page is also available in French. Michael, can you please move the slides? Thank you. The second part of our State of Mentoring Research Initiative is called Capturing the Landscape, and this is where we try to understand what mentoring programs and services look like in Canada, so that we can establish national trends and understand the prevalence of mentoring programs and services in the country, and identify pressing gaps and challenges in programs and services, so that we can, as a CMP, and we can, as a collective, develop new tools, trainings, and resources to support to support mentoring programs and services across the country. Another goal of this research initiative is to understand who is active in the mentoring field, so that we can act as a convener and bring together mentoring programs and services across the country. And finally, obviously, all of this work is also helping us advocate for more public and private investment in youth mentoring across the country. Michael, if you can please move to the next slide. And this is extremely exciting. We are launching today our survey of youth development and mentoring organizations. Our partners at SRDC worked overnight almost to get this done in time for you today. I will be copying the link in the chat box in a moment, but this survey is open and we really need your help so that we can capture the mentoring landscape across the country. So if you, your program or your organization has a youth mentoring component to its activities, we really encourage you to complete the survey. The sooner the better. If you fill it by May 29th, you'll get an additional chance of winning one of our prizes. We know that this takes some of your time, and it is an investment on your part, and we hope that you see the value in responding to this type of survey. And I'm sure Mike will be sharing a bit more about what Mentor in the United States has been able to do with a similar survey in the past. So we are offering some prizes as incentives to recognize that you are taking time out of your day to help us and help the general field of mentoring understand what is happening on the ground across the country. So I'll put the link in a second. I'm almost done. I have one more slide before I hand it over to Christina. Michael, if you can please move it ahead. Right, and very excited to announce this. This is also a new addition to our State of Mentoring Research Initiative. We added this component only a couple of weeks ago because we realized that we were looking at what young people's experiences of mentoring were. We were looking at what programs and services looked like and what were some of their challenges and some of the opportunities on the ground. But then we also wanted to look at the third critical component in that mentoring triangle, which is the mentor. We want to know what motivates adults in Canada to volunteer and become mentors, and what might be the barriers that prevent them from mentoring. So we will be working on this over the next few months and have some results to share with you by the end of the year, so that programs on the ground have a better idea of who is more likely to mentor in their community, and they can be more effective with their recruitment strategies. We will be examining differences in patterns and engagement across demographic groups, particularly for Indigenous, rural, and remote communities and underrepresented groups. So these findings, we hope, for all of these research projects will be helpful to identify people who can work with us to increase the quality and the effectiveness of mentoring across the country. Right, so I'm thrilled now to pass the baton to Christina Hackett, and she has some very insightful things to share with us today. We've just completed our some preliminary analysis of the data we got through the panel survey for the youth survey, and we're thrilled to share that with you today. Christina, if you can unmute your mic and turn on.
Thanks, Dominic. Yeah, sorry, I was waiting for the slide to turn over. Thanks, yeah. Really excited to present on some of these early findings from the nationally representative youth survey. So if you can kind of scroll forward a couple more slides. Yeah. So so my name's Christina. I am, as Veronique mentioned, working with the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation. SRDC is a nonprofit Canadian research organization that's been around for over 25 years. SRDC was initially created to develop, field test, and rigorously evaluate programs and interventions, and to conduct research across multiple areas of public policy to help improve the well-being of people living in Canada. We do a lot of work in the area of the area of health, education, literacy and essential skills, and certainly an area that is a passion for me that I like to focus on is youth development and youth development programs. So we're really excited to be part of this project. So next slide. So as Veronique mentioned, the State of Mentoring in Canada Research Initiative aims to map the gap and capture the landscape. I'll be presenting today some of our findings from the Map the Gap phase, focusing on results from the nationally representative survey of people aged 18 to 30. So in this survey, we asked people 18 to 30 to reflect back on their experiences with mentoring, either having access or not having access to mentoring between the ages of 6 to 18, with a focus on 12 to 18 in terms of mentoring relationship characteristics. So in addition to this survey of a panel of youth, as Veronique mentioned, we're working to gather experiences of more youth across Canada. So spread the link around, and we will also be doing qualitative work to explore young people's experiences of mentoring and the meaning of mentoring across contexts. You can go to the next slide. So this is part, as Veronique mentioned, of a larger program of research, and we're focusing today on the survey results. So we can skip ahead probably to the next section. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a bit of a background really briefly, because I want to get to our findings, which is the exciting part. But it's worthwhile noting that the process of developing the survey was really collaborative. We have a research advisory committee comprised of, I think, 15 or more research and practice experts, as well as 3 young people who, including Ashley, who's here today, who bring a ton of knowledge and wealth of experience to the table in terms of helping shape the research. So we can go ahead to the next slide. I know there's Sorry about the animation. So this is a big area to explore, and so I wanted to share our areas of inquiry that are helping to shape what questions we're addressing with this work. So what proportion, we were interested in what proportion of young people in Canada we call having access to a mentor. So proportion of people aged 18 to 30. What type of mentoring is that? What proportion wanted mentoring but didn't have access? So what were some of the barriers people experienced, and what are some of the unmet needs people reported? What are the dynamics of the mentoring relationship? We focused on, we asked people to reflect on the most meaningful of their mentoring relationships when we explored that, and what are the social, economic, education, and health outcomes or mental health outcomes of those with and without access to mentoring. So those are the sort of 4 broad areas that we looked at in the survey. This is just an overview of the 4 sections of the survey. And so we started with asking respondents to talk about themselves, about demographic characteristics, as well as current living arrangements and employment status and educational attainment. And then we moved on to ask people about whether they had access to any mentor or any meaningful person in their lives. And then ask people who reported that they did have access to a mentor to reflect again on one of those experiences. We then asked people about their lives between the age of 12 to 18, and some of the strengths and challenges in their lives at that time, and then also lives currently. So we can move on to the next slide. So this slide is just to represent that we really started broad. We wanted to understand people's experiences with meaningful people and then hone in on different types of mentoring relationships, formal and informal. And regardless of whether people said they had a formal or informal mentor, if they did have a mentor, we did ask everyone about unmet need, barriers to mentoring, and experiences of mentoring, and then again focused on the most meaningful relationship. So move ahead. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our sample. So I'm reporting on the panel of people aged 18 to 30, again around 3,100 respondents, and who they are and some of their characteristics, their access to mentoring, barriers to access, some of the relationship characteristics, and some of the outcomes. So again, these are very early analyses, and in this, so essentially, overall, our sample tended to mirror the Canadian population. You know, the dark blue is our sample, and the light blue on the left is the age distribution based on census data. And on the right, it's the gray. And so in terms of age, our sample tended to match pretty well into that of the Canadian population, as well as gender. So in terms of people who identify as a woman or a man. And then we had more representation from people who identified as non-binary. Not really a good sense of how many people identify as non-binary in the youth population. So we had about 2.7% in our sample. So we can move to the next. So in terms of geographic representation, there was less than 3% difference in terms of kind of proportions across provinces, with the exception obviously of the territories, which is why we are targeting and hoping to have more responses in our non-representative survey sample by sending it and focusing on gathering information from young people living in the North. And then in terms of urban and rural spread, you know, the vast majority of respondents lived in urban or suburban areas, and about 2% remote, 14% rural. In terms of different ethnocultural characteristics and other demographics, about 10% of our population self-identified as Indigenous, and about just under 40% of our population identified as non-white. And I won't read out all of these different proportions, but I will highlight that about 57% of young people identified that they had one or more risk factors during the ages of 12 to 18, and about 38% that they had about 2 or more risk factors during this time. So in terms of access to mentoring, just over half of all respondents reported having any mentor between the ages of 6 to 18. And then of those people who said that they had access to a mentor, about 32% said they had access to a formal mentor, and 67 to an informal mentor. So from the total sample, about between 17 and 18% of all respondents reported having a formal mentor during the ages of 12 to 18, or sorry, 6 to 18. So you can go to the next slide. So this is just a visual representation of accessing mentoring by age and relationship type. So the light blue represents having access to a formal mentor, and on the left is ages 6 to 11. On the right is between the ages 12 to 18. So about 42% said that they had access to a mentor, 24% to a formal mentor when they were younger. And in adolescence, about the same amount said they had access to any mentor, and 30% to a formal mentor. So next slide. So unsurprisingly, perhaps, the vast majority of people talked about mentoring and their experiences with having a mentor as being overwhelmingly positive. So the 0.7% is, you know, so under 1% of people reported having a negative experience, and everybody else really talked about mentoring as being positive. And so I'll talk a little bit about that after, but there's definitely a positive wave of experience for mentoring. Go to the next slide. So what we looked at, what we were interested in our second question was, does access to mentors differ with demographic characteristics? So if you just want to go ahead one, yeah. So the little SIG notations at the bottom of the slide just denote that the finding is statistically significant at the level of 95%, but essentially all the groups that you see listed on the bottom of the slide, so Indigenous people, people who identify as transgender, people who identify as the visible minority, or having a functional disability, or having risk factors, identifying as a man or as non-binary, all reported having increased access to a mentor. Or sorry, above the line, you see everybody up until risk factors had increased access to a mentor. Sorry, people who identified as a man and as non-binary had decreased access to any mentor. Apologies for that. And then for access to a formal mentor, we see that all of those groups, when controlling for other demographic factors and age, had increased access to formal mentors. And I'll just talk a little bit about that with respect to people who identified one or more risk factors in a couple of slides. So again, this summarizes that the characteristics related to having higher access to a mentor included these different ethnocultural, gender, disability, and environmental factors, which we were surprised at. We were, we were surprised at the fact that some of these groups reported having increased access to mentoring, or an increased likelihood. So if we want to just scroll ahead, then when we looked into it, in terms of having risk factors, access to any mentor is slightly higher for people who have one or more risk factors, and higher for access to a formal mentor for people who have one or more risk factors compared to no risk factors. We want to just click ahead. And also there was some evidence in the sample that those who are, who identified risk factors may be more likely to initiate mentoring themselves. So at this point, we're gonna do a poll. We're gonna ask you to reflect on if the preliminary findings mostly confirm or challenge what you thought about the mentoring field in Canada.
Sorry, Michael here. For some reason, the poll's not working, so I think we'll have to move on. My apologies.
Okay. Okay. So when we looked at, I mean, I kind of expressed that we were a bit surprised by the access findings based on just our experience and other research, but and some is confirmed by other research. But when we looked at unmet need and barriers to accessing a mentor, there was an interesting story there, and essentially that youth do report experiencing times when they wanted to have access to a mentor or more mentors, but didn't. And so slightly more than half said that they had some kind of unmet need between the ages of 6 to 18. And so even people who did have a mentor, and if you just click ahead as well, yeah. So on the left, you see unmet needs reported by youth who didn't have a mentor, and on the right, you see unmet needs for youth who had a mentor. So you can see that for young people who had a mentor, they have much higher report of also having unmet need. And when we asked about barriers to accessing mentoring during adolescence, and these were some of the findings. So the largest proportion of responses came from young people saying they didn't know how to find a mentor at the time, and didn't understand what it was or what the value would be, or that there weren't any mentoring programs available to them. And we had some open-ended responses. Some young people echoed that in their comments. So if you just click ahead again. So we looked at, just like we looked at demographic characteristics in terms of having access to a mentor, we also looked at demographic characteristics with respect to having unmet need. And so Indigenous, visible minority, non-binary, transgender, people who identifying as part of the LGBTQ2S+ community, people with disabilities and people identifying risk factors were more likely to report unmet needs for mentoring during adolescence. And this just sort of echoes that. So in terms of relationship characteristics, there was an average of 2.5 mentors for people who reported having them, and 96% of people said they had under 5 mentors, essentially 5 or less. And 80% said that their most meaningful mentor was an informal mentor. 55% reported having one-to-one mentoring. Mentors had diverse relationships to youth, but teachers and school staff were sort of the largest majority or most commonly reported. And mentoring was most often reported to take place in the community. The most widely reported focus of mentoring relationships was emotional or social supports, followed by school, spiritual, religious, or cultural supports. And most people said that their mentor was at least 6 years older than them. And again, the idea of the experience of mentoring, rather, the mentoring relationship was overwhelmingly positive. So I want to be clear that these are relationships, not, these are just associations between having a mentor and some outcomes in current life. So these are based on the responses to Section 4, Your Life Now. So people who had access to a mentor were more likely to report higher levels of self-rated mental health, sense of belonging, and more likely to want to be a mentor to others or be interested in that, and are less likely to be not in education, employment, or training. And so, to be clear, the data are cross-sectional. We're asking people to reflect back in time about their experiences, and this represents a moment in time. And so these are sort of preliminary relationships we're seeing, and they are just that, just sort of relationships. The sample of people who were included in the representative sample that we're reporting on are representative of young people across Canada on a number of characteristics, but of course there are still experiences that may not be represented in this sample, which is why we're doing other data collection. And then the meaning of the word mentor really influences how respondents may perceive their experiences. And we also asked about the most meaningful mentor. So this also enhances the likelihood that, when thinking back about a mentoring relationship, people will be thinking about that as positive. So if you want to just go on to the next slide, I'll wrap up. So essentially, our next steps are to look at other sources of data and to continue to explore what we have so far, and to highlight other uses of these data, as it's a really rich data set. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing. I'll turn it back to Veronique. Would you like to introduce Ashley?
Yes, please. Just a reminder to everyone, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this. In the meantime, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. We're more likely to see them there. You can also, if you prefer, put them in the chat box, but there will be time for questions, and there's already plenty coming in. So we will revisit some of those in the question period. And thank you, Christina, for sharing those findings. And now I'm very thrilled to introduce Ashley, who is one of our key members for our research advisory committee. And Ashley, if you can please tell us a bit more about how you've been involved in the development of our surveys, and why this research is important to you and your organization and the young people that you serve.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. And thank you so much for inviting me as well to be one of the youth representatives and to present today. I guess to start off, I wanted to share a little bit about my personal experiences with mentoring, and then I'll go into more about the like how I became part of the research advisory committee. So I've had both formal and informal mentors in my life. My first mentors were definitely people who were informal. Like, for example, when I think back, one person who stands out is my karate instructor. Another person who stands out is an individual I met while attending a summer education program, and he helped me apply for undergrad and gave advice on like applications, just how to get there, how to make it through the last little bit of high school. And then my first formal mentor came when I was 17, and I had finally been admitted to undergrad. And then she was someone who provided a lot of advice about like starting at school, what frosh was, and what goes down during frosh week, how to survive as a native student as well, and in a new city, especially because I was moving across the country then. But I think when I look back, though, I think I would also have benefited from having non-education related mentors. And I don't think I knew that people like that would have existed, especially when I think of myself as a teenager. I didn't really know much about anything then, so let alone programs that set you up with mentors or help you help you meet people, prepare for the future. But yeah, so I think this is something that might get towards more of the unmet needs part. But first I'll talk about the how I became a member of the advisory committee. So it was Christina who reached out to me about the project, and it was like way back in August or September. I was asked to help bring my experiences to inform the development of the survey. So at the time I was president of Youth in Care Canada. I'm now the secretary of the organization. Youth in Care Canada is a national organization that's led by and for youth who have been in child welfare systems across the country. At that time, and still now, I was on the Anishinaabe Nation's Youth Council, and was able to help share a bit of a perspective as like a Native former foster kid. I saw it as this was an opportunity to start filling some of the gaps I've noticed in a lot of research. Like for example, in undergrad, you go do all those like psychology surveys that people are paying you $25 to do, and they usually like they'll ask questions that aren't necessarily relevant for someone, or not necessarily relevant or appropriate for someone who, for example, doesn't have like their parents in their life, or someone who's in a group home now. And I thought that by providing advice to this survey, I'd hopefully be able to inform how it's written, how youth in care are approached and engaged by the questions as well. And I found too that a lot of times research won't capture like youth in care, but also First Nation youth, unless it's like research that's specific to them. So in like big surveys, that'll just be like glossed over, or questions won't even be asked about Indigenous identity or living on reserve or being in child welfare at all. And that does have impacts for Youth in Care Canada, since we're always looking for better ways to support youth in and from the system. And we can do our own research and send out our own surveys, but it helps when there's like more rigorous research being done that we can use to inform what we do as an organization. So this in particular, this survey has really good potential to reach Indigenous youth, reach youth in and from care. The panel that was used for the preliminary findings did have some surprising results. I was pretty surprised that Indigenous youth were more likely to have a mentor. I found that for both formal and informal mentoring. But the findings also did show that there were a lot of unmet needs for Indigenous youth, even if they did have mentors. And I would be interested in seeing that future research dive deeper into this. So I personally would speculate that perhaps those unmet needs could be from the timing or the type of mentoring relationship. So for example, having a mentor related to education, finishing high school and going to post-secondary, when at that point in life you might be 15 or 16 and really just struggling with, like for example, mental health, struggling with getting ready to become an adult and not necessarily thinking about school yet. For the youth in care part of the preliminary findings, there weren't as many responses from children and youth in care as I would like, but I can see how if we push this properly, so for example, Youth in Care Canada will be sending the survey out to all of our contacts, in particular the local networks across the country, and asking them to share with their with the youth they're in contact with. I'm hoping that there'll be a bigger reach and that they'll get a lot more responses from youth who are in and from care. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Do you have anything else to add?
Not right now.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
We will stay in touch for sure. Ashley's perspective is very, very informative. And as we are moving ahead and looking and diving deeper into the analysis, as we're looking at how we're going to do our focus groups and the qualitative part of the research, the insights that Ashley and young people are able to share on the findings are key in forming the types of questions we ask in the groups we work with in our focus groups. So thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Mike Geringer, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Mentor USA. It's a really interesting, I think it's really, really interesting to hear from Mike today, because a lot of the work that we're doing, a lot of these surveys and studies that are part of the State of Mentoring Research Initiative are inspired by work that Mentor US has done in the past. So Mike will share a bit more about their studies and their impacts and how it compares to what we're doing here. So thank you, Mike.
Mike, before you get started, this is Michael Jans here. Can you, I gave you control of the mouse, so you should be able to move through your own PowerPoint.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Veronique. It's great to be with everyone here today. I had hoped to be with you in person at the symposium in March, but fate intervened, as it will from time to time. But it's really great to be with you virtually today, and just really, you know, happy to share kind of what we've done over the past few years with you, and I think it'll fit in seamlessly with both with what Christina presented, but also Ashley, thank you for reminding me of my greatest fear in research, which is that we will leave out key groups of informants when we talk to young people about their experiences and what they need and still want from mentors in their lives. So I really appreciated your voice in this as well. So let's go ahead and get down to business here. I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that we've done over the years that really mirror in many ways the studies that we discussed at the very beginning of the webinar here. I'm going to mention three in particular that we've done in recent years. And for the first one I'm going to talk about, we'll do a little bit of comparison between what we found here in the US and some of the results that Christina just reviewed for everybody. I think there's some interesting comparing and contrasting to be done between our two countries. I'm also going to talk a little bit about two other studies, but then really kind of the value that all of this work brought to Mentor as an organization and to the mentoring movement here in the United States. And we really do think of it as a movement, right? We think of it as something that goes beyond individual service providers, that is something that is a reflection, hopefully, of our values as Americans and the way we step up for young people. And so obviously there's always room to grow in that area, but these studies were really instrumental in allowing Mentor as an organization to do its work. And I think you will find much the same to be true as the Canadian Mentoring Partnership does their work in this vein over the next few years. So the first study I'm going to talk about is one that is most analogous to the one that Christina just gave you preliminary findings around, and that was one called the mentoring effect. And this came out in 2014, and so it actually came out right before I joined Mentors. So even though I'll talk to you today about the findings and kind of what we learned, I may not be able to answer every methodology question because I was not around to develop it myself, but I've got a pretty good understanding of how we did it and what we did. So hopefully if folks have technical questions, I'll be able to answer those as well. Our impetus for doing this was really to kind of learn some critical things that you would have thought maybe Mentor would have already known by 2014, but for many reasons, we kind of just hadn't done this kind of research prior to this. And I really want to credit David Shapiro and the people that were at Mentor at that time for having the vision to do this. And I asked David the other day, what was the real, reason? Why did you decide to kind of do this crazy survey asking people to reflect on their mentoring experiences? And he said, people just kept asking us for a number. Every time he would go and talk to a potential investor, a politician, a mentoring organization, everyone wanted to know, like, well, how many kids have been mentored? Like, what's that ratio looking like? And we didn't know. And so we really set out to try and highlight the prevalence of mentoring and see if there's a gap and what that gap looks like and who's not getting the mentoring they need to thrive as they grow up. It also helped us set a benchmark against which we can measure national progress. I'll talk a little bit later about why that's a little bit tricky to measure progress against that number, but at least we know, right? We have a sense now of who needs more mentoring in their lives and who's maybe doing okay with accessing mentors. It was also our chance to really learn more about natural mentoring. So, when you're in an organization like Mentor or the Canadian Mentoring Partnership, you wind up working a lot with mentoring programs and people that work in formal programs for young people. But we wanted to learn about the very wide ocean of natural mentoring. If you think about it, when we all reflect back on mentors we had in our lives, it's almost certain that we will think of somebody that was an informal mentor to us. I mean, a few of us got connected to somebody through a program, but for the most part, informal mentoring really is the heart of this movement. And we didn't know very much about it at that time. So we really had a number of key things we wanted to learn in doing this study. Whoops. Let's see if I can go back here. So a couple of key details about what we did. We talked to about 1,100 young people between the ages of 18 and 21. So a little bit of a narrower age range than you've done in Canada. We also did multiple kind of outreach methods as you've done. The in-person, much as in your effort, was an attempt to reach young people that might be underrepresented in that sample. I commend you all for getting responses from about 3 times as many young people. I think the more you can talk to is the better. Always gets more accurate as you involve more voices. But we did wind up with a statistically representative sample. We did apply some minor weights to the findings and the analyses so that no one group was overrepresented more than they should be or underrepresented less than they should be. So theoretically, this is an accurate snapshot of what American young people said. As I said, we asked about kind of formal structured mentoring and informal or unstructured mentoring. You think of that as programmatic and non-programmatic is kind of the easiest way to break that down. We, much as you have done, also asked about various risk factors. We really focused though on ones that impacted the transition into adulthood. So we asked about a narrower range of risk factors than you all have done in your Canadian study. You know, we mostly asked around major things. Were you homeless at some point when you were a child? Teen pregnancy, you know, struggles in school. But there were some major things that we, for whatever reason, didn't ask about. Things like substance misuse or even experiences of abuse and trauma. We just didn't include those for reasons that I'm not aware of. We also included respondents in this kind of at-risk category, and I hate to describe young people as at-risk, but that's the term that's used kind of in the report. If at the time they were filling out this survey, they were not in school, not in a job, not training to go into a career path, kind of, you know, those disconnected young people, as we sometimes refer to them here in the US. They also kind of fell into this, you know, risk factor bucket as well. So I just want to clarify some of that because it's not exactly apples to apples with the way you asked some of those questions in the study that Christina just broke down. So here's what we came up with in terms of a gap, right? So we found that about 1 in 3 young people said that they grew up without a mentor of any kind. So that was a sobering number for us. There have been other studies that had found numbers that were a little higher than that. There's a longitudinal study of young people in the US called Ad Health that found about 75% of young people said they had a mentor in their life. We found a little bit lower than that. Once again, how you ask the question, how you define that can have a major influence on how people answer that. But this was the breakdown, right? So you'll see that about 62% of all young people had an informal mentor. Programs only reached about 15% of all young people. Now that's impressive. That's about 1 in 7 young people got served by a mentoring program of some kind, and that's great reach, but I think it illustrates why natural mentoring is so important to the movement. I think we could double, triple the size of our programs and still not be meeting all the needs that need to be met. So in our view, mentoring has to involve both of those worlds. Now, in terms of those at-risk youth, unlike Canada, we found that they were less likely to have a mentor in their lives. You found that they were slightly more likely to have a mentor in their lives. But very similar to Canada, we found that they were about twice as likely as youth with no risk factors to have had a programmatic mentor, to have a structured mentoring experience. So that's very similar between our 2 countries. So this was kind of the roughest breakdown of it in that study. We really then also looked at some real inequities in who's in that gap of not having had a mentor. Unfortunately, we found that youth who were struggling academically were less likely to report having informal mentors in their lives. They may have been getting programmatic mentoring. Often they're referred to programs because they're struggling in school, but this really highlighted that, you know, a lack of adults outside of formal programs is playing a role in their challenges as well. Perhaps most troubling to me in my mind was that about half of informal mentors were extended family members, and that number increased for young people who are at risk. So, you know, a lot of times these informal mentors were an aunt, an uncle, an older cousin, and that's great. I mean, it's fantastic that young people have those strong ties to caring adults in their family, but, you know, there's also these weak ties, which are connections to teachers and coaches and pastors and people that are kind of outside your immediate circle. And unfortunately, you know, our young people reported less of that, I think, than they did in your survey. I was happy to see that teachers seem to be the largest contributor to informal mentoring relationships. And so, you know, this really suggested to us that young people that are facing challenges of poverty or other, you know, life experiences, they're just less likely to make connections to adults that can provide them with opportunities, with with things that'll help them thrive moving forward. We also found that mentors arrived a little bit late. Kids were less likely to report having had one in elementary school than they were later in life. So we also looked at the impact of mentors on young people. We really report a lot of these in the report around at-risk youth. I won't go through all of them here, but you'll see that having a mentor was correlated with a number of positive impacts on young people. Structured mentors seem to be providing a lot more academic support. Informal mentors were more likely to touch on personal topics and things like that. So we also, similar to your survey, asked about whether mentors were valued, and unsurprisingly, both structured and informal mentors were incredibly popular. I agree with you, Christina, that I think when you ask young people about their mentoring experiences, they often only remember the good, although I think, you know, I look back and I had a basketball coach in high school who I would consider to be an anti-mentor, if you will. So sometimes, you know, you recognize when adults fail you in this role, but for most often, you're going to think about somebody that was really there for you. And we found very similar things around the value that that brought. It was also interesting, though, that in both programmatic and informal mentoring relationships, the length of that relationship seemed to matter. Lasting at least a year or longer seemed to really correlate to some levels of satisfaction with the experience and how helpful people thought it was. And I think that just makes sense, particularly for an informal. If that's helpful in a good relationship, you're going to assume that it's going to last longer. If it winds up not being what you need, you're likely to cut it off, I think, more likely than you would maybe if it's a programmatic mentor. You might try and make that work a little bit longer than you might if it's somebody that is more easily cut out of your life, so to speak. Oops, I keep skipping ahead on accident here. So in comparison to what Christina presented, I think in Canada, it seems like your overall rate of mentoring might be slightly lower than the US, but your young people are more likely to report having had a structured programmatic mentoring experience, right? And the age ranges here differ a little bit, but I think it seems to me like you're doing a better job than the US perhaps in getting mentoring to young people who have needs, and you're using your mentoring programs specifically to kind of fill in those relationship gaps. I think it was also encouraging to see that in your data, and I think we need to unpack this a little bit more, Christina, but it looks like you all are doing a better job of getting mentoring to young people at younger ages when they're perhaps more open to the influence of a mentor. Unfortunately, in the US, you know, I see a lot of mentoring programs that are, you know, trying to help struggling high school students who are off track to graduate. And not that that's bad work to do. We need to mentor those young people too, but oftentimes, you know, they're struggling with issues that would have been much better addressed when they were younger, and not waiting kind of until a crisis point in young adulthood. It's unclear to me from your data, but it seems like informal mentoring seems to be pretty accessible for Canadian youth. But as I mentioned earlier, you seem to be doing perhaps a better job of creating these extra familial connections for young people with needs, right? And you know, I think that's a credit to your teachers, other professionals that interact with young people for really stepping into that void. I think in the United States, we're still working at that. And, you know, once again, you know, just too many young people in our survey reporting that it was only an extended family member that was there for them. And I think, you know, that's helpful and that's great, but I think we need to go beyond that. And it seems like your country might be slightly ahead of that. I do think it's interesting, and Christina, you touched on this, that Canadian youth who'd had a mentor were more likely to report unmet needs. I think, you know, in some level, I think if you have a mentor that's helping you with some aspects of your life, you might be more likely to recognize that you still have things that aren't happening for you. I think if you've wanted a mentor and have never been able to get one, or just haven't been able to get that support, I think there's a bit of a wall that goes up, and I think those kids are more likely to say, well, I didn't need a mentor. I didn't have any needs. I think there's a bit of a defense mechanism that may happen in those questions. But I think it's good that young people that got mentoring support were able to reflect back on that and still see need. I think one of the things that I've encouraged Mentor to do when we talk about that mentoring gap is that we don't close it when we get a kid their first mentor. I mean, yes, they do go into that I've had a mentor pile, so to speak, but that doesn't mean we've won the battle for them, right? That doesn't mean that they've got all the help they need. And so I think I like talking about the mentoring gap as one that is omnipresent, because we all need multiple mentors kind of throughout our lives and at various challenge points, right? I may get a mentor when I'm in middle school and really struggling with, you know, who I am as a person and school and stuff, but I might need a different mentor when I transition into my first job or go off to college, right? And so we can always work to close that gap, but at some level, the reality is that all people need mentors, and I've come to think of mentoring as a human right, to be honest with you, and something that our societies just need to provide young people across the board, no matter what. And so, you know, it's helpful to kind of define that gap, but I think it's a gap that is tough to close, and we shouldn't probably think of it as being closed, because that means that we stop doing the work. So I will stop there and see if folks have any questions about anything I just covered before I talk about these two other studies. Veronique, is there any burning question about those things?
At the moment, it seems pretty good. I think
Okay.
we can see what people have when we get to the Q&A portion. We're getting closer to it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll cover these next two studies real quick, and I think they mirror things that have already been previewed that are going to be happening in Canada. We did a report called The Power of Relationships last year, and that was analogous to one of the studies that's been mentioned here, where we asked American adults for their side of this. We asked young people, did you get a mentor when you were a kid? This was asking adults, do you mentor? And once again, you would think maybe that we'd already known that or had asked those questions of the American public before, but we really didn't have a great sense of how many adults were mentoring, particularly in those informal relationships. And so we did an online survey that we wound up weighting and wound up with a margin of error of about 2%, which is pretty good for one of these things. We asked about who mentors and why, or if they don't, why don't they? And is that changeable? If our job as mentors is to recruit adults to step up for young people in this way, we need to know if there's a ceiling on that. There may be some adults that just will never want to mentor a kid, and that's probably okay, because they probably wouldn't make great mentors if they did it. So we asked all kinds of questions about how they met their mentee and so forth. I'll show one slide here that just has a million things happening on it. But it is illustrative, I think, of the rich information that you all can find in that report. Thanks, Michael. Oops. Keep advancing more than I want to here. Michael, can you make the slide go back a little bit? There we go. Thank you. So just as a real shorthand way of explaining this, we found that about a quarter of all Americans had mentored a young person in the last year. About 10% had mentored through a program. Another 15% were doing it informally. And as you can see here, kind of along the bottom row, I'll just read this left to right, about 31% would not consider structured mentoring, or they wouldn't mentor at all. About 20% said that I would do it informally, but I don't really want to do it through a program. but everyone else was either doing it in a program, doing it naturally, or would be willing to do one of those types, right? So add it all up, there's really about, almost 80% of Americans are willing to mentor a child in some capacity. And that was a wonderful number for us to learn. And I won't go into everything that we learned in this study, but we learned all kinds of demographic things about what kinds of recruitment messages appeal to certain types of adults. The number one barrier that folks reported to why they weren't mentoring, they didn't think there was a program in their community that was doing this work, or they didn't really know how to get involved. And so I think a big chunk of what the Canadian Mentoring Partnership is going to be doing over the next several years is just educating Canadians about the landscape of this field and how they can get involved. There were very few people that said, I don't like children and I don't want to help. They were there. Unfortunately, we have them in America, and you can guess as to who they are, but very few people said that. And I think that was greatly encouraging to us as an organization. The last study that I will talk about very briefly, I know we're short on time, we did do a program survey several years ago, very similar to the one that I think you just launched today for Canada. You can find this report on Mentor's website as well. Asked a ton of questions kind of at the agency level. So who are the organizations that are running programs? We're really surprised by some of the findings there, just the diversity of types of organizations that have decided to do something around mentoring, and really learned a lot about just the needs of programs, and that really supported our advocacy work, our fundraising for the movement, mentor recruitment campaigns, and so forth. So I really encourage all of you in programs, fill out the survey that launched today, really let the Canadian Partnership know what you need, how it's going for your organization, who you serve. It will just help them in everything that they try and do to grow the movement in Canada. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. This was a great selling point. This survey is tremendously important for us. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but and we really need your input to know how we can work together to grow the mentoring movement in Canada and support organizations who are offering mentoring services day to day. So we need to know what you need and how we can help you. And we also need to know what are your strengths and how we can leverage those strengths to help other organizations across the country. So I pasted the link again in the Zoom chat, and it will be on our website on Monday. We just need to update the website. We will also be following up with an email invitation. We just literally finished this morning, so we haven't had time to update our website, but we did want to let you know that it was live. So finally, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Cristina Rinaldi, who will be telling us a little bit more about what else is happening to grow the research field on youth mentoring in Canada. And she will be telling us a bit more about how the University of Alberta, the Alberta Mentoring Partnership, and the Canadian Mentoring Partnerships are working together to make that happen. Cristina? Again.
Hello, everyone.
Great.
So coming to you from Edmonton today, I'm delighted to be able to speak about the Canadian Centre for Mentoring Research, and specifically, I'm not sure if we can go to the first slide. So in Canada, we have, we just newly established the centre in 2019. In most of the countries, and obviously we heard of the different research in the States, they have a counterpart that we do, which is like a center that is focused specifically on mentoring research. And so we felt the need to be able to develop a center that was specifically Canadian based. And so the current composition is a interdisciplinary smattering of people from the U of A, which is myself, and others from kinesiology, education, School of Public Health. And then, of course, our partners who make up the executive team is the Alberta Mentor Partnership and the Canadian Mentoring Partnership. I think it's really important to be able to have representative research. What was interesting and a thread that we kind of heard from everyone today was that the research is evolving. We always need new research. I know a lot of questions that we get is like, well, don't we know the answer to that? We might, but as you can see, our context shifts all the time. I don't think we expected to be in the situation where we are today. So maybe new research questions will be very relevant about how do we mentor online, and how do we do things remotely, and how do we access people in ways that maybe we already have been, but now the forefront will be that we have to be kind of like pushing this forward in an even more accelerated pace. And so the importance, to the next slide, please, is that what our hope and purpose is that in the creation of the Center for Mentoring Research is that we advance knowledge about mentoring, about youth mentoring in Canada by generating and supporting rigorous and innovative research. And I know those terms get thrown out as well. So we've heard a lot of interesting survey data, comprehensive, cross-country, which is really important. But I think our center is really interested in, I'm going to kind of really quickly review our objectives. And this is where we get the input, is to have that representation about research that is actually ongoing, and how do we consolidate that research across the country and bring it all together in one place that's easily accessible, that is able to answer questions and not be so far-reaching or difficult to access. So just to jump into what our main objectives, they're pretty lofty, but we believe we'll be able to get there. So our center will work with scholars to generate original interdisciplinary research on youth mentoring. So when we, and as I heard this morning, and even before we've had these conversations, when we are dealing with extreme mental health issues right now, I'm getting calls off the hook this week about how to help support people so I have always believed that mental health is an important area, of course, for study for children and youth and families and beyond in our communities. But it seems like a lot of other Canadians are starting to realize, oh yeah, this is a really big thing right now. And so how do we connect people together? So bringing together who are actually conducting research in these areas will be really critical. We want to raise the profile of Canadian research so it's not so difficult for you to have access to this. And I think that's always been a call that CMP and AMP have kind of like been talking about. Well, if that research exists, how do we get our hands on it? How do we get that? And how do we translate it into a meaningful context? So we hope to do that, raise the profile through our communication, our dissemination, and connection. And we want to facilitate access to Canadian youth mentoring data for research purposes. And this takes a little bit more thought and is more complex because we might have access to databases. We know that they do in other places. In the US, for instance, they have a way to access in a very targeted way to like answer specific questions to larger data sets. And we want to make that be less onerous, more available, and yet meeting the standards of important research practice. And our last three goals. We want to act as a convener by fostering these connections and providing an exchange between Canadian academics interested in youth mentoring. We want to bring these researchers together in a formalized way. So that's going to be a big piece for us. We're also going to be working, or we have been since its inception. What's really neat is usually researchers are begging other people to help us, and we're asking for money and we're asking for ways to conduct our research. But here, our founding partners, which is Alberta Mentoring Partnership and the Canadian Mentoring Partnership, they came to look to the researchers and said, can we enhance this knowledge mobilization and have these research findings used by all levels of those who are working in the mentoring field. So the researchers, the practitioners, and the policymakers. And then finally, the center really intends to help mentor the next generation of Canadian scholars And to be more thoughtful, what I'm hearing from the different panelists too is that this discussion between the formal and the informal mentoring is that there is actually quite a large body of informal mentoring research that we haven't accessed, and that is happening in Canada. And so how can we not only mentor the next generation to be very clear that this is the work that they're doing, and to develop those skills for us, what we do is we train obviously graduate students. So we want to make sure that we position our future generation of scholars, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in the best way possible. And then finally, we will have a website presence. We will be highlighting existing Canadian research so you can access that very clearly. And we hope to have a resource platform. We understand that our partners have excellent resources, but what we're hoping to is to have the research resource platform that will be understandable and accessible. And we won't inundate you, promise, with electronics, news, and communications, but we will have some of that as well. Hopefully, good information that can be used by everyone. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm very excited by all the findings and the insights that everyone shared today. We know that often we tend to rely on findings that we see in the US or in the UK to inform the decisions that we're making in Canada. And I'm thrilled to see that even in the last few months, we are been able to work together with the University of Alberta, with SRDC, to advance the evidence base for youth mentoring in this country, so that we're able to take better decisions, more informed decisions when it comes to our mentoring programs and services. And I think that's key for us at CMP, right? This knowledge mobilization, this knowledge translation piece is key, and that is the role that we play when working with the Center for, the Canadian Center for Youth Mentoring, for mentoring research. Sorry, we went through a couple of names for the center before we settled on this one, so sometimes it's hard to remember where we're at, but as Christina was talking about, it is the Canadian Center for Mentoring Research. We kept it simple at the end of the day. So thank you all of our panelists. Everyone is still here and able to answer questions. So please, I invite you to use either the Q&A or the chat box at this time to input any questions that you may have that we have not answered yet. Pour les francophones, vous pouvez également écrire vos questions en français et quelques-uns d'entre nous sont bilingues, donc nous pourrons répondre aussi en français. Sinon, nous allons faire appel aux interprètes pour nous aider à traduire nos réponses. Donc, je vous invite à utiliser la fonction de chat ou la fonction Q&A pour mettre vos questions afin qu'on puisse y répondre.
Veronique, there was one slide about, or sorry, one question about the where to from here for a few of these items. I was wondering if you could sort of speak about that.
Sorry, one slide?
Sorry, it wasn't a slide, it was more in general. So we've heard the webinar today. We heard some hot off the press findings that we haven't unpacked yet. We heard a bit about the direction, about where you want to go. For the listeners who are in attendance today, if they want to keep engaging and if they want to keep participating, what can you sort of share a bit about where to from here?
Yes, so as you can see, we're only starting to dive into our analysis, and a lot of you have questions, and they were very good questions, but we know that we will get there eventually. We just, doing good, diligent data analysis takes time. So thank you all for your questions, and we are aware of them, and we will integrate them in our analysis. But in the next few months, we will be releasing reports and webinars and things as we get more and more findings. So this is an ongoing project. It's not like December 31st, we will send everyone the final report. We will release things as they become available, because we know that it benefits the field tremendously to get these in a timely manner. Right now we have this webinar. I expect there will be many, many more webinars as we as we dive deeper in the analysis and have more things to report on, particularly in terms of outcomes and relationships to youth outcomes. I had a poll that we couldn't share because of technical issues, but I'll put it in the chat box. If you're interested, you can highlight what you want. It's about how you're most interested in learning about our findings. So what medium works best for you? So either a webinar, a podcast, reports, blog post, or an interactive dashboard. All of these are options. I mean, you can choose everything if you prefer to have all of those media, but if there is a medium you prefer over others, just highlight it so we know what works best for you, and we develop a knowledge translation approach that that is adapted to your needs and your time and what you can offer.
And we have a question here for Dr. Rinaldi. If Dr. Rinaldi would like to unmute her mic, how does mentoring in a structured program help support the development of social emotional competencies? And if Dr. Rinaldi, if you want to share, or Veronique, if you want to share as well too, please just unmute your mic.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is existing research on that, but not from the Canadian context that I'm aware of. But we do have data generally, so not specifically looking at formal mentoring, that we know that those, as we heard, those relationships. So we have data looking at teacher-child relationships in classrooms when there are positive relationships between teachers. And that does change between developmental stages. So in early years, K to 6, we see the stability of more or less one focal educator, whereas when you move into the 7 to 12 or 7 to 11 in Quebec years, grades, you find that they have multiple educators or access to multiple educators, so some consistency or one key focus, but those teacher-student relationships and the quality of those have shown to have protective factors and have made significant differences in the lives of in the lives of children and adolescents, but specifically in promoting, because they're modeling or they're helping them access resources that they didn't know of. So I'm kind of interweaving a lot of information from studies generally, but there are specific ones that have looked at these specific relationships that are important. And then with respect to the data that both Christina and Mike have referred to, you can see some themes as to like wanting more access to information and not knowing how to make those connections. And a lot of the times we find that what is really important, especially with mental health, of which social emotional functioning is a subset of, is that students, youth, adolescents, but even those around them, the biggest thing is like how to access and how to access good information and good sources of components of whether it's resources or educational or psychoeducational material. How do we access that, and how is it relevant for the age and stage of the individual in their lives? We heard from Ashley and her lovely reflection of like what was going on for her at different stages of her learning, but also if you think about your peer relationships change over time. We do have data and information broadly in the general literature and research about how we need to support children, youth, and even young adults that's reflective of their stage of development. So I think there is data on that. I know it's very broad in general because right now I'm trying to like think of the existing research with respect to your question on specific structured mentoring, but I think I'm more familiar with the non-structured mentoring and how we definitely have proof and evidence of supporting social emotional well-being and functioning.
And I think Mike just mentioned that Mentor just put out a resource on it. Again, Mentor is the Canadian Mentoring Partnership's mentor in a way. That the work that they're doing is very aspirational for us sometimes. So do you want to share anything about that, Mike?
Yeah, I actually didn't work on it myself. My colleague Delia Hagen worked on it, but You can find it on our website. It's basically a guide around the connection between mentoring and social emotional learning. It profiles a number of examples of programs that are doing that work. It also has a really excellent summary of the research, both on the programmatic and the natural mentoring side, written by Bernadette Sanchez from DePaul University here. So really great resource on it. And you know, just to echo what you said, Christina, I mean, all positive human relationships build SEL skills at some level. I think what's a little unclear for me as to how intentional mentoring programs should be about asking their mentors to, say, use a curriculum that teaches those things, or, you know, it's unclear to me how much of that just happens through natural good interactions and role modeling versus how much of that should be done via kind of a purposeful effort around those topics. But it's all good, I think. If you're in a good mentoring relationship, I have no doubt that most young people will improve in those skills with the help of a mentor. It's a safe place to practice some of those skills, safer than with your peers in real time, I guess. So that's one way a mentor can help.
Veronique, I want to make sure we get to this next question. It's from Corinne, who said, the research seems to be focused on youth mentoring and personal development / providing social and emotional support to youth. Any of the research touching on youth mentoring with more of a focus on professional / career development / self-employment? And later on, and then Annie also asked us a similar question about focusing on the research on youth mentoring, or would there be different populations included as well too?
Yeah, I think I can give a partial answer to that, and then I think I'll just lob this to Christina Hackett probably to talk about what we're going to be doing next in the analysis of our survey of young people and their experiences with mentoring when they were growing up. But it is definitely, both of these are areas of focus. They're themes we will be exploring in subsequent analysis, and with even the service providers survey that we are launching today, we will be looking at mentoring programs that focus specifically on these outcomes and these areas as well. Christina, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think that some of the in the youth survey, there are so many questions that we haven't even gotten to, and we do have questions related to career planning and educational career attainment or aspirations. And so I think we will be looking at that, and we can't do it all. So I think, you know, one of the things that we're really excited about is the ability to share this data eventually and have other people explore research questions that we just won't be able to get to. We have so many exciting, you know, variables, and I, you know, just to say that, you know, every question that we included was informed by our review of the literature and conversations with young people, with the research advisory committee, and we put a lot of thought into those questions. So everything feels really relevant. That's why it's really hard to decide what to show and what to kind of present. But yeah, I guess stay tuned.
Thank you for that. I was wondering, I had another question here. Sorry, I think it might have disappeared on me. But Mike, I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on just kind of that last slide that you had in terms of how this research has been helpful to the field, and what the American experience has been for, say, actioning this knowledge. When the novel, could you share about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming here you mean across kind of all the studies I talked about broadly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think each of those studies has helped our work in multiple ways, right? So I mostly come from the world of kind of technical assistance and training development and kind of, you know, supporting mentoring programs to do their work more effectively, right? And so I think the more we learn about kind of the mentoring that young people say they've received and experienced, the more we learn about how adults want to come to that work for young people. We're obviously able to help programs with their recruitment and things like that a little bit better, helping figure out how programmatic mentors can work in tandem with natural mentors to provide kind of a team of support to a young person. There's a lot of great research around that. Our colleagues at the Center for Promise here in the US have a great report called Don't Quit on Me that was specifically about young people that had left education early, dropped out of school. You know, they basically found that it takes a team of people working together to get those young people back on track. It's not about one mentor playing Superman, right? So that's changed some of our language. Obviously, a lot of these studies have really helped in our advocacy work, the way we work with political representatives, both at the federal and the state level, to really get them invested in mentoring. And some of that comes from our original research, but a lot of that comes from our research synthesis and translation of other people's work, right? So if we have a politician who cares very deeply about a particular youth issue, we're able to synthesize information for them about how mentoring speaks to their concern, right? Whether that's gun violence or youth employment or whatever the topic may be, we're able, because we work with so many researchers and do some of this on our own, as Christina said earlier, we're able to provide real answers to policymakers and folks that have a need for information. So, you know, it's just, we couldn't do our work without doing some of this research stuff. There's more to our work than that, obviously, but it's such a key informant to what we say and how we say it in the field. It really does touch on just about everything we do.
Yeah, thank you for that. At our very first webinar on March 25th, we had a poll about how mentoring research could help the field. And it was, I thought it would be, just from my background, I thought it would be a lot more about how the research could help the case for investment. But a number of the respondents actually said how they were excited about how the research would help them make program improvements and better serve young people. So there's a real need out there, I think, to recognize that as young people today are going through different experiences, and as technology is changing and everything else, that the mentoring field in Canada is excited about being cutting edge in terms of how they serve young people, which was really exciting to see.
Michael, we had a question earlier about some of the categories of identity that we've used in our preliminary analysis and how those are not necessarily reflective of the multiple identities that people hold, and questions of intersectionality, and how we will be working to develop and refine better ways of reporting on the data that we receive. And you know, the way we framed the questionnaire was incredibly thorough in terms of young people's lived experiences and their identities. We do have to find a good way of conveying those complexities in our reports, and it's always a challenge where we usually focus on one aspect of identity or demographic identifier and analyze the data based on that. So maybe Christina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that about how we're planning on doing this going forward.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point because, you know, the slides and the categories that we rolled, you know, I guess findings up for the purpose of today really don't reflect the inclusivity and the process by which we came to the categories for the survey, with, you know, in partnership with, you know, people on the rack, including youth from different communities, as well as other youth and youth serving organizations in our networks. We thought really deeply about this. I think we do have to find a way to have these sort of cruder categories make more sense to more people. There's sort of like a realistic aspect to quantitative data, that there are always going to be categories and there are always going to be choices that, you know, don't reflect everybody's identities, but for sure we will be doing, we will have the space to be able to provide more nuanced findings and identities in our reports and in subsequent webinars. So thanks for bearing with us while we do that, and we continue to engage with our youth advisors on that.
Excellent. Oh, Mike,
Just
please
if
go
I
ahead.
could add a really quick point around that. I think it's always good to try and slice and dice your findings by different clusters of people and really looking at that intersectionality, because we do have multiple identities. I think we found some value in that power of relationship study at kind of lumping people together. We did some cluster analysis that really wound up grouping all of our respondents into 4 kind of main buckets of individuals. And that doesn't mean that everyone in those buckets was the same, but we did come up with kind of a 4-group typology, if you will, of the way people in America relate to the mentoring movement. So at one end of that spectrum, you have the diehard supporters of mentoring that, you know, are totally gung-ho to do it and don't really need to be recruited into the world of mentoring. But then, you know, as you went down that spectrum at the far end, there were what we called the mentoring rejectors, that were people that we knew would never probably be involved in our movement. But then we learned a little bit about those people in the middle, about what messages might appeal to them and kind of how we could view them as kind of, you know, groupings of folks that we could do targeted work towards reaching. And so there's times to like disaggregate it, there's times to aggregate it. As Christina mentioned earlier, you will probably never be done slicing and dicing it all the ways that you could, but hopefully other researchers will pick up when you're tired of looking at your data and do other new things with it as well. So.
Thank you, Mike. I think if I can ask a final question of Ashley, if you're comfortable answering. I mean, most of us here are of a certain age. Your experience, I'm sure, was very different than the experience I had when I was growing up. Anecdotally, what do you think is the future of mentoring for young people, Indigenous people, young people in care? Why is it important, and how can we work together to make it more efficient or better?
So I think I can answer from like the youth in care and the Indigenous youth perspective. Someone earlier had asked a question about Indigenous youth and Indigenous mentors. It was in the Q&A section, and I replied, and I think at least for Indigenous youth in care, I can see like in the future there being a really, really important role well, first of all, just for mentors generally, as people are transitioning out of care, also just like surviving through care. But in particular for Indigenous youth, Indigenous mentors could play a really huge role in addressing that that disconnect that often happens when kids are removed from their families and their homes and their communities and placed in non-Indigenous places. Like, for example, like if I think like someone on res being removed and then being placed like down here in Ottawa, like there's several kids from Anishinaabe Nation territory that I've met so far who are living in Ottawa right now and are in care. And they don't have access to their communities. They don't get to see their families, but having an Indigenous mentor could help with, I mean, like everything from just having someone to talk to who understands, all the way to like sharing like cultural things, like things that you should probably be able to access right now, but aren't while you're in a home. Yeah, I think at least from that perspective, that I think that could be a really, really important, like a really important role, especially as now, at least with governments and organizations have definitely been more progressive than the government in understanding this, but like, especially with how people are understanding that the child welfare system has contributed to cultural genocide. Yeah, I think that could be one, at least maybe more narrow than the question, but one like potential direction for future.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Michael, do we have anything else in the questions at the moment? I didn't see anything. If there's any last minute
there's been a few times people have just popped up and said, where can I find the slides or where can I get more information? And again, I just reiterate, please go to mentoringcanada.ca and sign up for our newsletter. After the presentation, we're going to translate the slides, make them bilingual, and we'll be sharing them. We're going to be storing the recorded webinars, the presentations, the documents, all of these pieces that Veronique and the panel have referenced. We'll be storing them on mentoringcanada.ca in the research area. That is forthcoming. It's priority for us to get them translated and available. So thank you for your patience. But the best way to get the just-in-time information, again, is to go to our newsletter.
Thank you, Michael. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our insightful panelists for their contributions today. I hope you found this conversation as interesting as I did. I'm obviously biased as research is my little area, and I love it just so much. I would also like to thank our interpreters. Merci beaucoup. I know how difficult it can be, and I don't make it easy for you because I tend to talk very quickly and I just can't help myself. For those of you, pour ceux et celles qui ont écouté le webinaire en français aujourd'hui, nous vous invitons à nous contacter pour nous faire part de votre expérience et nous dire si vous êtes satisfait du contenu et de la façon dont nous avons traduit le webinaire aujourd'hui pour que nous puissions continuer à nous améliorer et offrir une meilleure expérience pour les francophones lors de nos prochains webinaires. Donc, je vais mettre mon courriel dans la boîte de chat. Vous pouvez me contacter si vous avez des commentaires à ce sujet ou vous pouvez contacter info@mentoringcanada.ca, info.cmp@mentoringcanada.ca. Donc, plusieurs manières de nous rejoindre pour nous faire part de vos commentaires. Donc, en français ou en anglais, nos sondages sont maintenant disponibles en ligne. Our surveys are now available online at stateofmentoring.ca. Ils sont disponibles en français et en anglais, available in French and English. We will be updating our website by Monday. The survey of youth development and mentoring organizations will be accessible through our website on Monday. In the meantime, I will paste the link again in the chat box. If you're eager to complete it today, please do so. We are eagerly awaiting this information and the data that we will be able to collect that way. Michael, do you want to talk about what's coming up next for our next webinar?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And again, thank you to the entire panel, and thank you to all of us, all of you in attendance today. There's still over 50 different individuals listening from across Canada. I recognize names from different provinces. And it's critical to us that if you know other people who should be part of these conversations, that you reach out to them and please let them know about the opportunities that you've heard about and how we can connect with them. We're building something totally new together here in terms of a mentoring movement in Canada. And that means that we're trying to break into those different pockets and different communities and different geographies and different groups. And so more help that you can share in terms of helping make connections and helping share our youth survey, for instance, our service provider survey. We're building something that will ultimately, as Mike and the panelists have shared, benefit all of us and be able to help us scale great practices for young people in one area of the country with another. So it's very exciting. It takes time.
Michael, if I may add, I just want to reiterate that we're committed to sharing as much of this information as possible back with the mentoring field. We're not going to keep this data hidden or secret or anything like that, right? We're committed to transparency, and we're doing this to benefit the whole field. So part of that is our commitment to getting that information into the hands of everyone involved in the mentoring field in the country.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into our next our next conversation, which is going to be May 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern on designing a national collaborative. So it's going to be exactly what we're talking about here, about partnerships, about working together, about a collective impact strategy, about how what we're doing can help grow the impact that we can make together across the field, and how we can take existing best practices from even internationally, as Mike has shared, and others, and help scale them up across Canada. So please do go to mentoringcanada.ca/events, and you'll be able to learn more there and register. And finally, thank you. Back to you, Veronique.
Sorry, it's me. My screen is covered with the chat and the Q&A and the screen, so it's hard to see what's on the slide. So once again, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for having joined us today. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our interpreters. I think that we have great things coming up, so stay tuned, and I hope to see some of you again when we have follow-up webinars and other events to share more findings as they become available.